PowerPlayChess, brought to you in association with Kagi. Here's your puzzle of the week, White to Play and Win. This is taken from the game between Leonore Poetsch and Heike Koenze, played in the German Under-18 Championship for Women in 2019. Now, hopefully that's given you a bit of time to work things out. White to play and win. Of course, if you want to solve the puzzle interactively online, then do check out the link to chesspuzzle.net and you can see the complete game there as well. Right, are we ready? White to play and win. Boom! Queen G7 check. That's quite a spectacular finish. So obviously if the king moves, then queen takes rook check. So rook takes queen, pawn takes. Now, it's not quite over. Of course, it really is over if black takes the pawn, because the rooks come in, and that's a very simple checkmate on the H file. Okay, so what about king G8? Well, rook takes H7, and again, this mate is on the card. So F5, then rook H8. I mean, that at least gives the king an escape square. Rook H8. So again, king takes pawn, rook 1, H7 is mate. So king F7, forced. And now rook takes C8. Threatening to get a queen, so the pawn is taken. But then the rook just switches back, and there's no defense to rook 1, H7 mate. Okay, so quick recap. Queen G7 check, rook takes, pawn takes. Now, actually in the game, black played king E8. And white got a new queen, and queen takes F7. So in this position, white is a whole rook up, and there's more to come. Well, black really went for it with knight takes B2. But white doesn't need to bother taking the knight, and after queen E6 check, in fact, black resigned. Well, if the king goes that way, then that's pretty clear. Queen and rook look good. And if the king goes back, again, rook takes H7. And black can mess around with some checks here, but actually with a couple of delicate moves, there are no more checks. That's the easiest way to do it. It's the quickest way to do it anyway. Once the checks run out, then it's white's turn at the other end of the board. Now, I thought this was a very interesting position actually, because let's go back. Now, that's the position where queen G7 was the killer move. And nice idea, nice concept. But white has just played rook H1, and black replied with A5, and queen G7, it was game over. The question is, okay, here's a supplementary question for you. I'll flip it round. How would you defend against the threat of queen G7? Now, it's clear that black missed this, but I'm going to give you a chance to defend with black. In some ways, I think this is well, it's a more subtle puzzle than the actual game continuation, which is very nice. But sometimes it's interesting to think of defensive moves. You know, first of all, you have to spot this. And then you think, okay, well, how can I possibly defend? Well, I like this option. Queen B6 is possible, but I like knight B6. Because the queen and the knight threaten the pawn on D5. It also opens the C file for the rook. C2, there's pressure, perhaps rook C4. And here's the thing. If queen G7, then that can be taken. Now, be careful. Of course, if the pawn is taken, then that is still checkmate, as we saw before. But black has a defense. This time, king G8 works. Because if rook H7, okay, there's still a threat of rook H8 and rook H7 mate. So f5 gives the king a square. Rook h8 check. Again, don't take that pawn, but black plays king f7. And the knight defends the rook on c8. That's the crucial thing. So obviously rook takes, knight takes, and there is nothing going on there. And if, well, there's nothing happening here. I mean, white can try rook here. I mean, it's possible just to block, but in fact, the counterattack at the other end of the board is absolutely deadly. And that's actually checkmate. A killer. So well done if you found knight b6. I think it's a good move. It's interesting. Let me just take you back a few moves in this game. So I'll flip it back. So here black played a5, knight b6 was a good move, and queen g7 was the winning move. But if we just go back a few moves. Now, here white, I think, has a fantastic position because that rook is completely out of play. And here is where white hit upon the concept of this queen sack, which is really daring. But actually, if the queen sack isn't working, then the rooks look a bit silly here. So in fact, it's much better for white in this position just to play rook e1 because the rook is completely out of play. White is playing with an extra rook and has a beautifully centralized position. There's a beautiful knight coming to d4, potentially to c6. That must be a winning position for white. But it was very interesting that white tried the super ambitious doubling on the h-file and got away with it. Fair play. Interesting stuff. Hope you enjoyed that. If you want to see more puzzles, then do check out chesspuzzle.net.